Welcome. This week we are going to be painting a little island just off of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. And this little island is called Shack Island. It's very close to the shore. And in the 1930s, they built, or people built, some little shacks there as little holiday cabins. Well, I think they actually lived in them to start with, but then they became holiday cabins. And now they've become part of Piper's Lagoon Park and Neck Point Park, which are two parks on either side. And people still use them for holiday cabins. And they're brightly coloured and they're kind of rough and ready little shacks. And people have been asking to paint this for a long time. So I found a picture by David McLaughlin and asked his permission, and he said that I could use it. So here we go. We're going to paint Shack Island, and get your paints and your paper, and let's see how we do. Here is the photo that David McLaughlin took of Shack Island, and here is the exactly the same size watercolor. You can do the bigger one or the small one. It is kind of tricky to do the small one with all these little shacks in it. And I have put a little bit of masking fluid on the boat and on the white parts of the shack. Now you can use white paint afterwards. That's perfectly acceptable for those little areas. I'm still struggling with the masking fluid and trying to give it a go. So the first thing we're going to do is wet the sky just down to the horizon line, because we're going to put in the cerulean blue up here onto a soft wet edge, and then we're going to mix a little bit of cobalt with the cerulean and put in some slightly darker streaky clouds down here, because in the photo it's a little bit more pronounced in the photo, but it's very easy to lose that white quickly on a watercolor. So I'm going to emphasize the white a little bit more. I'll zoom in just a bit and make sure we're in focus. There we go. And get this ready. And so you want a good size brush to wet. I've got a number 10. So I got get plenty of water onto that paper. Anyway, nice straight line along your horizon if you can. And I just pull my brush along that line and get that nice and wet. And then I'm going to mix up some cerulean blue. A slightly smaller brush. I'll start with my number 8. A little bit of water on my palette. And then some. Now, if you've got wet paper, you have to remember not to make your paint too wet, because it will be too diluted if your paper's already wet. So you have to kind of have a little bit more paint than water. And then I want that cerulean mixed with some cobalt for the clouds near the horizon, so they're not quite so bright. Little mix there, just a cobalt and cerulean. And then I'm going to stick with my number 8 brush. And then I'm going in with the cerulean. I almost always start at the upper right corner so that I have paint in the corner. And I'm testing with this first brush stroke, how much is my paint going to flood into the water on my paper? Because sometimes you need to leave it a minute and a half before you put your paint in. So I'm sort of putting it in there, leaving it for a few seconds. And if it floods too much, use a Kleenex, not a kitchen towel. Kitchen towel is abrasive and hard and often has a pattern. The Kleenex nice and soft. Get your Kleenex screwed up. And if you want to push your cloud back a little bit, just very gently tap it. Do not press hard. Don't press it out of there. So I definitely want cerulean along the top, coming down into some lovely fluffy clouds. So you don't want, your paint's going to flow down, so you don't want to have too much, but you want your clouds to have some up and down shape, and not up and down equally, but some up and down in different patterns of up and down. So I'm just gently sort of manipulating mine a little bit. And again, if I feel that they're not fluffy enough or soft enough, I can take my Kleenex and ever so gently just soften off the tops, really, really gently. Otherwise, you're going to get a very hard, not very nice effect to your cloud if you push hard. So just gentle softening. It will do its own thing. Just let it do its own thing. And I'm going to switch to a number 4 brush, a slightly smaller brush, because I'm going to use that cobalt and cerulean mix. And I'm going to pull this along the bottom near the horizon. So clouds, as they come down near the horizon, they get thinner and longer. So we've got the combination here of the big fluffy clouds and then the slightly thinner clouds and the shadows in the clouds. And my paper's just starting to dry up. See, it doesn't take long to dry. So I have to be just a little bit careful. I've got a damp brush, just slightly wet, and I'm just going to just manipulate that paint a little bit. Now, of course, as you learn more about painting and you want to put your own colors in, you can put extra colors in something like this, but we can keep it simple. We don't want to go too crazy difficult today. So I'll let you do that. I'll let you work on your sky before we start on other parts of the painting. I'll leave that there for you. Our next step is going to be the orange cabin and the water around the orange cabin, because we need to get the orange reflection in the water. So it's very helpful to mix the orange and do that all in one go. So you can use a cadmium orange, you can use a transparent orange, or you can just mix a red and a yellow to get an orange. And it literally doesn't matter what orange you get. These cabins are quite old and the paint's quite faded. It's just really nice in amongst all that blue to have that orange as the complementary color. It's kind of just a fun thing. So let's get mine where you can see it. And I'm going to mix an orange. I will just mix a cadmium red and my azo yellow, because that is one of my favorite ways to go. Oh, my azo yellow is very green. I do try and clean everything up before I see you, but sometimes I get painting at the weekend and I forget. So a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, and I have something that's almost exactly like a cadmium orange. And I don't need very much. I have my number 4 brush at the moment. And first of all, I want to put the cabin in. And I have masked off the windows, which are boarded up with white boards. But even though they're masked, I can still kind of paint around them. And then there's logs on the beach. And then there's this there's a solar panel on top of this part here. And I'm presuming that it may be like a shower or something here. I don't know. But there's a big solar panel on the top and it sort of kicks out away from the hut here. We're going to paint the back of the it's like a carport area, obviously not for a car because no cars go there, but some kind of a port area there for putting your boat. And I think the struts are painted orange. I'm just going to put those in to start with. Then I'm going to wet my brush and being careful to paint not where the beach is. I'm going to make sure right under this, wet my brush a bit more so it's a wet, watery reflection. Right under this hut, I'm going to go back and forth in the water and put a reflection in here. Now, I don't want to leave that too long. Let me zoom in so I can get pull my camera up a little bit. I want to get some blue in before that dries. So I'm going to use on my first layer, I'm going to use Phthalo Blue. If you don't have Phthalo Blue, you could use Prussian Blue. And if you don't have Phthalo Blue or Prussian Blue, you can use Ultramarine Blue. I'm just going to use Phthalo because it's a very nice bright blue and it's going to go underneath the darker ultramarine. So I want it quite watery, and I have my number, let me look at my number 8 brush, and I want to put in this area, the Phthalo Blue in, and I'm going to be very cautious as I come up to the orange because it's wet. And if I'm using Phthalo Blue, I have to also be cautious because it's a staining color and quite intense. So I'm diluting it quite well and coming in from the sides. And then I'm going to gradually come up to the orange and make sure I don't go over it too much, or I'm going to get a very gray color. I just want them to hit each other wet in wet for the reflection. If it does go a greeny gray, that's okay. It will all come out in the wash. We're going to have a ultramarine wash over the top. So if it's not perfect at this stage, that's okay. We have over the top of that, we're going to put ultramarine and even some darker paint over the top. So it's just our first wash, which will Phthalo Blue, although it's quite intense, it will dry quite a lot lighter when it's dry. So I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm going to put this Phthalo Blue everywhere, well diluted. I'm going to get a little bit more diluted out, and I'll put it under the camera so you can see how diluted, because it's a strong paint. You don't want it really, really strong. I'm going to dilute it out quite a lot. And there's also this area between, over here is the Piper's Lagoon, I think, or it may be another part of Shack Island. There's 2 parts to Shack Island. It may be the other part, but there's also the Piper's Lagoon spit coming out. I can't remember which part this is. I kayak around it enough, you would think I could remember. And anyone like Sharon who lives close can probably tell me. She sees it more often than I do. Anyway, I'm going to leave, as I do this Phthalo Blue over here, I'm just going to leave a few little bits of white dry paper showing, just for sparkles on the water. If they don't happen, don't worry, you can put them back with white paint or not have them at all. That's fine. And I'm using dry paper so I can very carefully paint around the rocks of the island, get them nice and sharp, hard edges. I did go and take my own picture to sort it all out in my head, but who knows where they are, on my phone, I think. So I've got the bay between the 2 parts, and I've got the reflection. And of course, the next part I'm going to do is all of this ocean back here. So I'm going to paint on dry paper. So I'm going to switch to my number 10 brush, my biggest brush, so that I can get my paint down really quickly. And I want my paint nice and watery, because all of that light paint behind the ultramarine is my first layer. And that's what gives you the kind of the wave pattern, the sparkle on the water. So you don't want it too dark. You want it quite diluted. It should move around on your palette. And I have masked my boat with masking fluid. So I'm going to start very, very carefully at my horizon line and go back and forth, dipping my brush all the time in my mix so that I don't run out of paint. The good thing is, if you do run out of paint, it's not as bad as the sky, because you can have some skipped areas, if you like, that become like little white caps in the water. So it's not as critical as skipping on the sky. And I'm just going to leave those little white skipped areas to look like white caps closer to the shore. You don't want to have them too far in the distance, and it will give a little bit of a echo of the white sails of the boat too. And like there are other cool blues that would work, such as the cerulean, but the cerulean is more opaque and granulating. So the reason I'm using the phthalo blue is it's transparent, non-granulating. So I don't have to worry about all that opacity or granulation. I've got a nice flat wash that's gonna dry nice and flat. And we did the washing line flat wash. Some of you did the flat wash for the grain elevator. So you've had a little bit of practice of getting back and forth with your wash, hopefully, anyway. And remember, the big no-no is don't go back over that when it's wet. Do not dip your brush or your paint or anything in this while it's still wet. Even if you try and put this ultramarine on while it's still wet, you're going to get a really big mess. Next week, we're going to, with our abstract next week, we're going to aim to get a big mess, but a beautiful, colorful mess. So we'll have you'll be trying to get the messy effect next week and controlling it rather than letting it control you. So when we've got to this point and you've all done this bit, then we'll go on to the triad this week and just let this all soak in and start to dry, so we can move on with putting some of the ultramarine and some of the other colors in. While you're still painting, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Quinacridone Magenta and our very last project too. If you don't have a Quinacridone Magenta, whoops, knocked my camera for 6. I have done some mixes here using Quinacridone Rose to see if we can get something close if you don't have one. Quinacridone Magenta is quite an expensive color, and I haven't found it in a student grade paint. My favorite is the one by Core, which is the golden paints. And the Daniel Smith is quite nice, but I found it a little bit more grainy than the Core. The Core one went on so smooth and beautifully. But if you notice over here, my Quinacridone Rose mixed with Phthalo Blue is almost exactly the same as the Quinacridone Magenta. So if you don't want to go out and buy Quinacridone Magenta, and you don't have one, the Quinacridone Rose mixed with the Phthalo Blue makes a perfectly acceptable one. I think you can work with that. Now, the reason I'm working with it is our final project on our final week is going to be Magenta Sunrise. And this is a photo of Pitt Meadows in the early morning. Trying to find the photo. Yeah, this is the photo by Ken Burns. So it is heavy, heavy, heavy on magenta. And you would need either a Quinacridone Rose and a Phthalo or a Magenta to do this one justice. And we're going to do a little bit of mixing with them today. And next week, of course, we have the more abstract one, and this has Quinacridone Rose in it. So if you have some kind of a rose, it's really, really helpful. I definitely don't want you to go out and buy a whole bunch of paint that you might not use. Now, this was when my printer had a nervous breakdown a couple of weeks ago, and I had to wait 2 weeks for ink. And I kind of liked this, where the pink and the green were badly printed. I liked that, so I decided to use that. And there was another beautiful photo that this person did too. So I decided to emphasize that beautiful, like golden green and the pink more in the painting. And I think that's going to be fun to do, just having them all blending. So just giving you a heads up. and what we're going to be using over the next couple of weeks. And why a rose or magenta are kind of important to have on your palette too. It is your cool, well, there's a big print of the photograph. It's very, very magenta-ish. The other color I'm going to use with this is Naples yellow. And again, you don't have to rush out and buy a Naples yellow for the final week. I've done all kinds of other mixes that are similar to a Naples yellow. Raw sienna with some rose and lemon is absolutely close enough. And I don't use it very often. It's a very pale color, but it's definitely that kind of creamy yellow you see in the clouds here. I'll put that away for a couple of weeks. So in our triad today, we're going to use the Quinacridone Magenta, the Quinacridone Gold, and the Phthalo Blue. So this is almost your perfect CMY triad, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, which is what you have in your home printer. But we're going to use the Quinacridone Gold for this one, just for a little bit of a change. If you don't have Quinacridone Gold, use one of your yellows in here and just label it for whatever you're using. If you don't have the Quinacridone Magenta, try mixing rose with Phthalo Blue to get this sort of magenta color and see what you can get. I've got a few here. This is just Rose Madder. That's Quinacridone Rose with Phthalo Blue. This is Quinacridone Rose with Cobalt Blue, which will be a bit more granulating, a little bit more soft. This is Quinacridone Rose with Prussian Blue, with Ultramarine Blue, again, a bit more granulating, not as soft. And this is Permanent Alizarin Crimson with Quinacridone Rose, not quite blue enough. And then this is different varieties, Quinacridone Magenta Core, Quinacridone Magenta Daniel Smith, Quinacridone Rose Winsor & Newton, and then Quinacridone Rose the Cotman Winsor & Newton, which is just not quite as bold, but $7 a tube versus $35 a tube. Quinacridone Rose Van Gogh Student Paint, $6, pretty nice. And Quinacridone Rose Daniel Smith, I don't know how much theirs are, but they're about $18 or $19. So just some comparisons here of the different ones, and definitely my favorite Quinacridone Magenta is the Core. So smooth. I have not tried the M. Graham Quinacridone Magenta, and that is one of my favorite paints. So next time I get one, I will try that, but they are like $30 a tube. They are an expensive paint. So that's why I say don't rush out and buy it if you don't need to. So let's start with the Quinacridone Gold. The Quinacridones are quite new colors. They were discovered in 18 something, but not used as paint until 1955. And DuPont released them as paint colors, I think, in 1958. So they haven't been around all that long. They're usually reds, purples, and yellows, and they are used because they are light fast. They don't fade. They're used on cars and clothing and everything because they don't fade. They're incredibly light fast. So let's start with the Quinacridone Gold. They also stain. So if you put them on your paper, you're not going to get them off again very easily. The Quinacridone Gold is really, really beautiful. Extremely beautiful color. Not available in its original form anymore. You cannot buy it anywhere. It was made for the car manufacturing companies in the 1960s that wanted a beautiful non-fading color. And then they went out of fashion. Daniel Smith bought every available known supply of Quinacridone Gold, and until about 5 years ago they sold it, and then they ran out. Now they just mix it from a couple of other colors. This is a PY 150 and P orange 48, pigment orange 48. So they've mixed it. It used to be just a single pigment color. If they ever bring it back for a car color, it may get manufactured again, who knows. Quinacridone Magenta, again, an incredibly beautiful color and very close to the magenta in your home printer. Very clear, very transparent, extremely staining. Lovely for mixing. Beautiful for mixing darks and purples. If you want a true purple or violet, use your Quinacridone Magenta or your Quinacridone Rose. It's absolutely gorgeous. Because it's so strong, you'd probably only ever need to get one tube, even though it's quite expensive. It would probably last you forever. And Phthalo Blue is the same as your cyan blue in your printer. The whole name is a combination of phthalo and cyan, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Long chemical name. It's your cool, strong, clear blue. And this is called the CMY Triad, cyan, magenta, yellow. The best one for mixing colors. I'll get that in there. Dilute it. The Phthalo Blue does fade quite not, it doesn't fade in over time, just as it dries on the paper, whereas the Quinacridone Magenta doesn't fade much as it dries on the paper. The Quinacridone Gold does a little bit, but the blue fades down quite a lot as it dries. Right, so now we're going to we'll mix the gold with the blue, starting with the gold. Now the Phthalo Blue is going to be very, very strong, extremely strong. So as you add it to the gold, I'm being very, very careful to add just the tiniest bit. Let's bring my mixing tray over a little bit. I already think I just had 2 little tips of blue in there, and I still think I got a little bit too much. You can, if you like a lovely, vivid, bright painting, you can use the Quinacridone Gold in place of the raw sienna. If you wanted that sort of raw sienna color. And a tiny, tiny bit more blue in there. I'm going to get some, if you mix the Phthalo Blue with the Azo Yellow or the Lemon Yellow, you're going to get some extremely bright, bright greens, spring greens. And then one more little tiny, tiny brush load of blue to get a lovely, lovely green here. Now, it doesn't matter if you never use Phthalo Blue on its own. When it's mixed with lots of other colors, you're going to get some beautiful colors, even if you never used it on its own. It's a great mixing one. So there's 3 greens. And then we're going to do the same up this side for the orangey colors that we will get. So start with your gold and then add in a tiny little bit of magenta. I think I'm dragging around a hair on my brush. So this is quite a vivid orange. Almost, it's actually almost like the transparent orange out of the tube. So now I want a little bit more magenta in there for a gorgeous burnt. Well, I'm going to put a transparent orange beside this to see if it's I'm pretty sure it's very close. And then I want a little bit more magenta for this one. I have a diluted version. More gold. Now let's get a transparent orange. And I'm just going to put it here. It's a bit clearer, the transparent orange, but it's pretty close to mixing the Quin Gold with a Quinacridone Magenta or a Quinacridone Rose even. So it's a lovely way to get an orange. I'll clean that up a little bit. And then let's come down this side, the rose and the phthalo. This is where you're going to get the lovely, lovely purples. So start with a good amount of rose. Keep putting my sponges too far away. And the tiniest little bit of phthalo blue. Ooh, it's already going into a beautiful, beautiful violet color. You won't get these lovely clear violets with any of your other reds, only your rose, your Quinacridone Rose and your Quinacridone Magenta. They're the only ones that will give you these lovely clear violets, unless of course you buy something called dioxazine violet, or not even ultramarine violet is this beautiful. Only the dioxazine violet is really this beautiful. Most of the other violets are quite soft. So this is with a little bit more phthalo blue. And I think I'm going on the last one close to the phthalo blue. I'm going to mix quite a thick, dark mix. I'm going to get a little bit more magenta, a little bit more phthalo blue, a bit more magenta. And I'm going to put a really, really dark mix of violet here to show you how dark you can go. Let's zoom in a little bit. See, it's almost black, just those two colors. Incredibly dark and vibrant. And I'll dilute it out in a minute. This is pretty close to dioxazine violet. And I'll dilute that out. Now I'll get some dioxazine violet and I will put it here. So this is the dioxazine violet right next to it. It's very, very similar. And the dioxazine violet is quite blue, and it's quite transparent, and it's a staining color also. So you can mix those lovely violets with these colors. Let's try equal amounts. You're going to get, oh, gorgeous dark color with equal amounts of these, and completely transparent. All three paints are transparent paints. So I have an equal amount here, a bit more blue. If I wanted it a little bit more black, it's a kind of a very, very dark sepia brown black. If I wanted it a bit more black, I could add a little bit more blue to it, which when I do the 70% blue, you'll probably see the difference. Just dilute that out a little bit for a nice soft gray. I'm going to add just a little bit more blue to it. So it's not an equal amount, and it's not mostly blue. It is, I'm just going to put that there because you can see if I add just a bit more blue to it, I really, really get a black color, something very dark. So now I'm going to have a little bit of magenta, a little bit of gold, and a lot of blue. So very, very blue. Just trying to think what you could call this. I'd call it petrol blue. It's almost like the blue of my shirt, actually. Let's dilute that out. Very dark. Okay, so now we want one that's mostly magenta. Let's take a little bit of the Quin Gold. Move this up a little bit. A little bit of the Phthalo Blue. And then a nice big brush full of the magenta. And of course, what we get is a really dark wine red. Let's take a little touch more blue to get a beautiful, beautiful wine red. Oh, I forgot to dilute it out at the end. Oops. Get my water. I'm a bit late now. Well, there we go. Let's just take it past the end. There it is. To a pinky color. The wine stain on the white carpet at the end there. And then one that's mostly Quinacridone Gold. I'll take a little brush tip of magenta, little brush tip of blue, and a great big brush full of gold. And we get a very transparent brown. You will never, ever make mud with these colors because of their transparency, which means that you can have a couple of layers of them and not sort of lose the translucency of your painting. There, just dilute that out. There. So you can see how much that phthalo blue has faded as it dries. Although it's intense, it's quite a nice color, quite pretty for, it's not dissimilar to the cerulean for the sky. If you're careful with it, you can use it in the sky. You can kind of see how the cerulean is more granulating and the phthalo is more transparent and smooth too. I'm going to check my notes to see what I did next. It's quite a few weeks since I painted this, probably 8 weeks since I painted it, so I have to go check. Yeah, so when the first layer is dry, you're going to have ultramarine blue and the phthalo blue and dry paper, and you're going to paint a few more waves, and you're going to paint it on the dry paper, and you're going to let it skip so that you have a look of ripples and waves as you paint. And again, you can use quite a big brush. Some people like to use a square brush for this. I just don't get on very well with square brushes, but some people do. So that's a personal choice. Where is mine? I don't even have many very handy because I don't use them very often. So this is what you'd call a square brush. This is a flat shader, it says, and a half-inch flat. So I'm going to have a go with them. I don't use them very often, but I'm going to have a go with them because the one thing they are quite nice for is for getting your straight lines going across. I think you can see my mixing palette. I'm going to start with a little bit of the phthalo and then the ultramarine and some water. Now I'm going to be painting on dry paper, so I don't want it to be too thick, the paint, and I don't want it to be too dry. I want it to really flow as I paint. And the ultramarine will help have that darker color. What I'm looking for is this darker color in the waves. And if I do another layer of phthalo, I'm not really going to get that look. I need to have the ultramarine in there to darken it up a little bit. And I need to kind of like test it, see if it's going to work for me. And although I never use a flat brush, I'm going to just try it, because what's life if you don't try things? And some of you may love a flat brush. I'm going to load my flat brush with that paint. And one of the good things about flat brushes is you can kind of drag them across dry paper, and you can get straighter lines sometimes than you can with see, if you use it on its side like this, you can get straighter lines than you can with a round brush. But I've just used round brushes so much that I'm used to using them. Now, what I've done now is I've dried off my brush, and I'm using it to kind of skip over the paper so that I get some dry look in the wash. I'm doing a few different things. I'm letting it skip. I'm doing a sort of a flat wash with it. What I do want to get is a little bit more close to the horizon line. Just, I can get it nice and straight with the edge of this brush. I'm going to try my other one, my Princeton, because I buy them and then I don't ever use them. I think I'm going to, but then I get them home and I don't. I'm going to try this Princeton one and see how that is compared to the other one. I'm just experimenting with my brushes here. This one holds more paint, I've already noticed. So it holds more paint than the other one I have. I tipped it up on its side. And I'm going back and forth to give those horizontal lines to the ocean. The nice thing is, you can, if you get streaks, it doesn't matter, because what we're going for is the streaky look. So I don't have to be fussed about going back over things and getting some streaks, because that's what I want. And as I come forward in the painting, I want the blue to be a little bit more intense. So I've just added a little bit more ultramarine to that wash. And right across here is quite a strong wave here. So I'm going to have that round about here. I'm going to put that kind of stronger blue color in and pull it back and forth. And then dry brush sort of look, skipping. And in some places, like here, it's quite light here. So I can go a bit more water with my paint to lighten it up a little bit. Because we have so much ocean in this picture, we want to do a little bit of something with it rather than just paint it flat blue, because it will be so boring to just have it flat blue when there's so much of it. And also have a little bit more. I can go, when you're painting like this, you can go back over it. It's not like when you're doing a wash and you can't go back. You can go back, you can add a little bit more, and add a little bit more color near the boat. And sometimes I'm dragging my brush sideways, and sometimes I'm turning it this way to get that nice straight edge from the brush. And you can do this with any brush. Like I say, I'm just experimenting with the brush I hardly ever use, just for the sake of it. A few more wavy lines. You can put them in slowly, build them up slowly, don't rush them. And see, it's already looking a little bit more interesting than just a flat blue. You want to have in between these two islands here, it's pretty light. So I don't want to do too much ultramarine there, but underneath the island right here, it's darker. We're going to come in even later with some more dark there, but we can put some ultramarine in there. You have to be careful you don't go over the edge of your land, though. You have to be a little bit careful with your brush. Right next to the land is always dark, and we're going to put some reflections in. And down here, closer to the foreground, much darker, and we will put a third layer of dark there. But we always start off light and then build it up. And it's going to be the darkest thing on your paper right now, so it's going to look even darker than you think it is. And this is when we can go over a little bit of that orange. The orange is dry, so we can go over the top and we can bring the blue in a bit more. We're going to have a lot of greenery coming here, but we've got to put the blue on first behind the greenery. And remember, always horizontal with your water strokes. And I'm going to just grab a little bit more paint and just come in here a little bit. So I've got a little bit of blue in between the orange. Always going to be very dark close to the shore. I think I just said that. I'm repeating myself. And I can go back a little bit. And it's still pretty light. I get a little bit more ultramarine on my brush. And I still think that this area is very, very light. I could have a bit more going on here. And because we're on dry paper with quite a dry brush, it's going to dry very quickly anyway, so you don't have to worry too much. A bit more texture going on in here. And here. And at any time you like, I'm going to get my other brush that's clean and dry it and dry my other brush really well. You can use a clean, dry brush to sort of even out your wash if you want to like pull it around a bit, manipulate it. If you feel like you need just a little bit of help with blending it in. A little bit more here. A few more waves. And then my clean, dry brush, just blending that in. Just doing that skipping with the brush, just pulling it over the dry paper and letting it skip. The more you do, the better it will look, because you'll start doing it and think, oh no, oh no, my line's too dark. Oh, but as you add more and as you blend them in, they will look more and more natural. Especially when you get all of this other stuff in there. I have to say my line between the clouds and the horizon don't look that good. And what I could do with that is I can soften it with a wet brush. I could wet along here. And I could just scrub a little bit with my Kleenex and maybe just soften that transition just a little bit. So it is very, very soft transition in the photograph. And you know what might have helped with that? It might have helped if I'd have taken my sky down below the horizon line and then painted over the top of it. I'm looking at this thinking I could have taken my sky color down to here and then painted over the top, and that would have given me a much softer transition. There's always something you want to change when you are finished. Now I've softened that transition between the horizon and the clouds just enough that it blends a little better. And then when we've got all of that in, and while that's drying, and I've used those poor little brushes that have sat there for years and not needed to be used, we can put the lovely colorful little houses in. So for I'm going to use just cobalt blue for this house to start with. I'm going to put some shadow on it afterwards. So the base color for the whole house will be a cobalt blue like this, and then we're going to come in with shadow for the rest of it. And the house over here is a more gray, greeny blue. So I've done cerulean blue with a bit of azo yellow for that one to make kind of greeny blue. They're tiny, so I'm going to my number 2 brush, my just plain cobalt blue. Cobalt is your softest blue that you have. Soft, warm blue, very easy to lift. And I'm going to paint that whole house with that. It's going to have some darker areas, and it's going to have some maybe white window frames, but I can't get all those in something this tiny at this time. I'll put those in later. For those of you that don't live here, everything on the beach here, there's lots and lots of logs in front of these houses. So I've masked off most of the logs because they're very, very light. They're bleached in the sun and the ocean, so they're quite light. This roof looks like, oh, great big piece of something on my brush. This looks like a corrugated roof here. So we'll put the dark corrugated lines in later. And the post here looks like it's painted blue. We don't have to have like all the details in. If we just add a few, it will be fine. And you can always use a pen if you find the details are too fine to do. You can use a pen when we're finished. So for this little shack over here, I want the cerulean blue. Let's get that blue out the way with a little bit of yellow. Put this here so we can see this too. I'm using my favorite azo yellow that I use from the everything. And that's very bright. So I'm going to take it down with a little bit more cerulean. And it's very dark on the side, but I'm starting with the blue, and then I will come back and darken the shadows. There's sort of steps in front of it. There is space under it. There's a strut that comes down here. There's some steps and some fencing here. I just put that on. So we've got sort of three different colors of huts. And a grey fence we can put on in a little bit. Now I just need to test. The ocean will dry really quickly because we worked on dry paper. Before we do anything on the rocks here, we just need to make sure that the ocean's not going to blend with them. I don't think mine is. I think it's pretty dry. And I'm also going to, in front of this orange hut, I want it a little bit more orangey, the ocean. I just want to go back with, I added a little bit more red to my orange. And I want to go back and just strengthen up that color a little bit. Just where that orange hut is. The other thing I can do, I've added a little bit more red to my orange. There is shadow on the side here and on the side of this little addition. It's in shade, so I've just added a bit more red to that orange. And there's also, looks like corrugated, got my tiny number 2 brush. And so I'm going to do the corrugated lines, or it might be siding, I don't know, but it's definitely got those kind of lines in it. So I'm just going to put those down as well. There's not much else in the way of color anywhere. So that's our main colors. And when we come to do these 2 islands, we're going to start with raw sienna, and we're going to add burnt sienna wet and wet to give it some texture. I'm going to start with this one over here because we've just painted some little wet shacks there, so we want to go over where it's dry. And we're also going to put some patchy green grass on. So before we start painting on dry paper, we need to mix up our raw sienna, we need to mix up our burnt sienna, and then we need to mix a green using our cobalt blue and our yellow, or whatever you like. This is a nice gentle, so the cobalt blue with the yellow is a nice gentle green that will be good for that scrubby grass that you get on top of these rocks. It wants to be fairly blue. It doesn't want to be too yellowish. Maybe a bit more yellow. I'm looking at the photograph and thinking, oh, maybe a bit more yellow. It doesn't want to be too bright. It doesn't want to be too verdant, like it's not, you know, it's not good grass. It's very scruffy grass. So I've got a little bit of cobalt and azo yellow, or you can use cadmium yellow there for the scrubby grass. I want some raw sienna for the main rock color. Have this all ready to go on the dry paper. And don't worry that this is going to look at mine. It's going to look quite yellowy and brown to start with, but we're going to put a lot of gray over the top. So don't worry that it looks kind of bright to start with. It's going to have gray over the top of it. This is your base colors. It's your raw sienna. I'm going to come up this end with the burnt sienna. Now, as you're mixing these wet and wet on the rocks, don't worry about it. It's so hard to go wrong with this because they are just a mess of color and rocks, and everything is going to get covered up by a lot of your gray shadow and your gray details. So you really don't need to worry if it doesn't look right. It's just going to be underneath the gray and the shadows. Oh, let's see what size of brush do I need for this little island. Probably what have I got here? I've got a 6 and a 4. I'm going to start with a 6 and see how I go. I'm going to get my raw sienna first. I'm going to work on this one. I have a little bit of masking fluid on here too, I think, for a few whites, little white highlights. And I'm going to put mostly sort of raw sienna on here to start with. Just my starting color. And the beach is going to be quite a light gray when I finish. So as I come to the beach, I'm going to wet brush and just diluting it out a little bit. Now, while that's still wet, I'm going to go my smaller brush, number 4. While it's still wet, I'm going to take my burnt sienna, and where there's going to be some gray shadow eventually, I'm going to put some, just touch some burnt sienna in there so it mixes wet and wet with the raw sienna. And that's quite wet at the moment, but what I will do when it dries a little bit is put a little bit of the green into. Not so much on this island, it doesn't have so much green in, but the other one does. So I'm going to do the same thing for this island here. Of course, I'm going to have to be careful as I go around the huts. So with my number 6 brush and the raw sienna, I'm going to do the whole thing. I've got a little bit of masking fluid on the edge there. Adding a little bit more water to my brush. I don't want to go over any of the blue on the huts. And as I come up to the beach, I don't want too much because I'm going to go quite gray on the beach. So I can just sort of leave that a little bit before I go light gray. You can put a little bit in if you want because you're going over with light gray. The rock down this side of the rock is quite light, so I'm adding a lot of water to my raw sienna, a lot of water. So I'm just coming down here with a very staining color. It's not just pure white, it's just a stain color. And again, the beach is going to be light gray. You don't have to worry too much about it. Now, before that dries, I'm going to my smaller number 4 brush, and I'm going to put in some burnt sienna, especially up here a little bit. It's a little bit warm over here and over here and behind the houses. I'm going back to that green that I mixed up, and I think this is soaked in enough now. I can add a little bit of green on here. So it's very patchy, just like the very patchy dry grass on the rocks. I can also put some over here. It's very, very patchy. And all these things can be added in later too. If you don't have enough at this point, you can put more in later. And it doesn't matter if it looks really patchy as you do your wet and wet, because it really is like that. It's patches of grass, patches of rock, patches of dry grass. And that's what you're trying to get the look of. And remember, this edge coming down here is quite light. I'm just sort of touching a little bit of that green to it. So I've got that patchy look coming down here. It's a little bit darker behind the shacks, so you can darken that all up later with another layer. We're definitely going to do that. If you look at my painting here, I've gone back with a darker green and put in some shadows when this is dried and sort of lightened up. It will lighten up as it dries. So I do have masking fluid on the roof of this shack and a little bit on the cliff here. And the little sailing boat. I'm not going to do any more to the ocean, so I can just lift the masking fluid off the little sailing boat to check out that it's okay back there. And of course the actual boat is dark, so we'll put that in when we do the roof colors. So we're getting down closer to the fine details now. And I'll let that paint soak in for a minute and blend wet and wet. And of course, if you at any time you think, oh, I've put that paint on too dark, these colors lift. You can always take a Kleenex if you want to. If you think, oh, I got that a little bit too dark, you can take it and you can lift a little bit off if you need to. And again, like if it's patchy, that's fine because it's very patchy. So don't worry too much. Now I'm going to, I think it's soaked in enough. I'm going to just mute and dry. Now I think at this point, I want to remove my masking fluid so I can actually get some clean lines on these little shacks where I'm going to be painting. I'm going to I'm going to leave these here and take this off the table because it's too wobbly for the camera when I do some masking fluid. I'll give you something to look at while I get this masking fluid off. I'm ready to do some of the darker colors. I might have to move the camera back a bit and move the painting back a bit so you can see so we can actually see go back camera. Toddle on back there a little bit. There we go. And I can bring that up a little bit there. It gives you a bit closer view of the houses as we start to put some of the detail on them. We've got to get some of the darks in, the dark roofs, the dark shadows, and all of those kinds of things. And we can put a little bit of texture on the beach and all of that to pick up all of this detail around the cabins. So for our dark gray, I'm suggesting you use your ultramarine blue and your burnt sienna, or you can use a Payne's gray. That's up to you. I really, really like the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mix that you can make to get a nice dark gray. So let's bring my palette over. A bigger brush for mixing. So I've got some ultramarine, I've got some burnt sienna rather. I'm going to mix some ultramarine blue with it. And a lot of blue to make a nice dark gray. I'm going to use quite a bit of gray for the rocks, for the shadows, for the houses, for the roofs. So there we go. Not too much burnt sienna, more ultramarine than burnt sienna until you get a good dark gray. I want I have a very, very tiny brush. It's a 000. And now I've moved all this back. I'm going to move it again. I want to do the boat back here first, or I will forget it. I just know that I will. So I want to just put the shape of the boat in with my little tiny brush. And I'm not going to touch this area of paint again, so it's fine back there. And there's a little tender, I think, being dragged behind it, which I needn't have done any masking for because it's black. You can see a little bit of the mast. Of course, you could use a very thin pen to do that if you wanted to. And I might tidy up the white with my P.H. Martin's white later. It has quite a tippy up bow to it, this sailing boat. Got that in. And we can go back to the cabins and not worry about that anymore. Now I'll go to my number 2 brush. You need a very small brush. Now you're going to really be doing some small detail. And the roofs of the cabin on the left here are very, very dark gray. So we can start there. I've got my photograph right there. So we can, you can't see it, can you? Can't see the cabin. The cabin I'm working on is way over here. Very dark roofs. Let's put those in first. They have a very light streak along the edge. I don't know if I can manage to leave that as I paint. I can always put it in with my white later. Has a little chimney, I think. I know when I kayak past these in the summer, there's quite often people staying in them still. They are used. And then this one in front. Again, it has a little white border to it, a light border to the roof. Be really careful with my little tiny number 2 brush. And inside this sort of shed thing at the side is quite dark. So I'm gonna go over to the side of that gray and add a little bit more blue to it. Just make it slightly more blue in here. And paint that shadow in here where you can't see in here, completely in shadow. But there is post at the side, so I'm going to try and leave that blue if I can. Pop that in. There are windows that are very dark. So this side of the window is really dark, and then the other side looks like it looks like sort of one side maybe has screen and one has glass. I'm not sure. Doesn't matter. We're not going to fuss about the details. We're just going to put them in as best we can. So I'm going to lighten that up a little bit. I'm going to use a little bit of cobalt with that. So what I'm doing is, to show you what I'm doing, getting a little bit of cobalt, and I'm taking a bit of that dark gray that I mixed, and I'm mixing it with the cobalt over here to make a lighter, more cobalt gray, because this other, and I don't know if I can do that, this other window is not quite as dark as the first one. I'm just trying to make it like slightly lighter. And the door too, the door is not, remember we painted the shack cobalt? The door is not quite as dark as the windows, but it's darker than the house color. The house in the background, really, really hard to see what's going on with that one. I'm going to use the lighter cobalt mix that I just made. And it has what looks like a couple of boarded up windows here and here. And I think it's going to need a bit more shadow on it when those are dry. It's a little bit light now that everything is dried. And I want to put the corrugated look to the roof here on there. I'm going back to that really dark mix now. And same for this one. Under this roof is some kind of a little place, open place to store things, but you can't see in it. So we're going to paint it very dark. There is a post on the side here that I am going to keep white. It all looks a bit strange when you first put the dark on, but we're going to blend it all together with shadows and rocks on the beach, and it will all blend together once we get everything on. The roof on this is reflecting lots of light, very white. I'll get that in there. The shutters on this house are white, but right at the side of them they have a thin black border. And of course we need a roof line along here. So you can do that with pen. If you feel your brush is too big or your hand not steady enough, you can put that roof line in with pen across there. And there's a lot of shadow between these two houses too. You can't really see very much going on between the two. And there's a log or something in front of this one, but there's shadow under here as well, and under here. Next shadow is on the top of this little hut or extension. Here is a solar panel, it looks like, and a black roof. So let's come down the black roof here and here and across the top. And we will put the lighter gray in for the solar panel when this is dry. So we've got a more definite edge to it. There's also a light blue shadow at the side of it, which we can't put in yet either. And the roof comes down here. The edge to this door or whatever this is quite black. Under this shack here is very, very dark. There is a post in the middle. You can, and there's, I think there's definitely a little stairway up to it, and like a little deck or banister or something there. The roof is grey. The side of it is quite dark, but the actual roof is a little lighter. So we're going to put the side of the roof in here. And then we're going to make the roof a little bit lighter with a little bit of rose added to the grey too. So what I'm going to do here is I've got this cobalt grey, and I'm going to add a little bit of rose to that. A little bit more of this grey to it. A little bit of that cobalt to it. And I've got a slightly different grey, warmer grey, diluted out. And this, the top of this roof is not as dark as some of the others. So I'm going to take that lighter, pinker grey to do this roof with. Again, the boarded up windows are white. And the top ridge of the roof is quite light too. The shadow underneath. And there's of course the shadow behind the house. We'll put that in with a bit of green. I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna to that mix and make it a more yellowy grey for this fence here. There's I think it's like a windbreak type fence or a privacy fence or something here. And it's slightly more raw sienna, lighter grey colour. It's going to be behind all of those green shrubs and things, so don't worry too much about it. I know it all looks a bit stark at the moment, but we've got to do the beach, we've got to do the shadow behind it, we've got to do a lot of other stuff that is going to make it less stark and odd looking. We can even do a little bit of lifting to have, say, seeing things inside this place. You can wet the paint a little bit if it's starting to dry and dab it, and it just kind of looks like there's something inside that space. Under here there's something inside this space too, so same thing. I'm just kind of wet it, dabbed it a little bit so it's not quite so flat. These little shacks are much more in shadow, so I will put a little bit more shadow on those. And then we have all the shadows on this island to do too. While I have that really light gray from this fence, I'm going to put that on the shore, on the rocks on the shore. I'm going quite dry brush, not too much pigment on my brush or paint. I'm going to just go a little bit more grain. I'm just going a little dark touches and get those gray rocks on the shore. I don't want it too dark. The shore is quite light. We are going to have where we have shadow coming up to the shore, there is some very dark shadow on the island here. So once you get the darker shadow in, your shore will look much lighter. And of course, then you'll have dark shadows in the rocks too. And don't be afraid of the dark shadows. They can look so stark when you put them in that you want to dab them out again. But that's only because you haven't finished everything else. Once you've finished everything else and put in other darks, they will look perfectly normal. There's all kinds of darks that need to go in over here yet before this hill is finished. I just put that one on the corner there while I was doing the rocks, and where the rocks meet the ocean, right at the edge of the shore again. Quite light. I'm just dabbing with the tip of my brush, just the tip, making sort of little dots that are these rocks close to the shore. Over here, you can see here, really dark there. I'm gonna get some more burnt sienna and add it to my gray. And I want to put in these very dark rocks over here. Everything's pretty dry now, so you can work all over the place like this, putting in stuff here and there, jumping around a little bit. So that area, there's some rock sticking up here, and it's really coming, it's very dark coming up this side. So all of this side of this rocky little island are in very stark shadow. So you can use your very dark gray, your ultramarine blue with your burnt sienna, and do all of this side really dark. And they have quite hard edges because it's all rocky. So you don't have to blend those edges with a wet brush or anything. You just have to trust that when you get them all in there, all of these dark edges and lines and rocks, it'll all flow together into one. You will see it as one rock that's got shadows. You can see it coming together already. There's still a lot of work to do on the shadows, but I'm going to my much lighter, now my lighter cobalt blue gray, because these shadows here are not as dark in these rocks. So I've gone to that cobalt blue with the raw sienna and some pink. And I'm making a much lighter gray for these rocks in here. And you might say, well, why did you put all the burnt sienna and raw sienna underneath then? Well, that's just so you have a variety of colors shining through all of these other colors. It's not just gray against this color, against that color. You have everything kind of blending that way and showing through, and you can have some of your rocks sticking out as the underneath colors. Makes it much easier to blend them all. Now on top of this rock, it's kind of textured, this rock and this grass. So what I'm doing is I'm taking that very light bluey gray in here and kind of just dotting it in. Don't have to paint it flat. And coming down from here again is quite a strong shadow. And if you don't get it dark enough the first time, then you just come back with another layer. It's not a problem. With my little tiny brush and my burnt sienna, just burnt sienna, there's a sort of a log here. Some of the cedar logs are quite reddish browns. I'm just popping that in there. And while I have that color on my brush, just the burnt sienna all by itself, there's quite a few logs down here that are also those kind of cedar logs in that reddish brown. So which the reddish brown goes really nicely with the blues. So I'm going to pop that in here. There's one there, some here. There's some logs on the beach. They're quite thin and long. Let's put them on the beach. That's why I wanted to get rid of some of this masking fluid. And some of the logs are quite light, so you don't want to fill them, definitely don't want to fill them all in. I'm going to put a little bit of, where I took some color out, I'm going to put a little bit of burnt sienna in back here. I'm getting a few logs on the beach now. And I can also use my raw sienna because that's also a good color for the logs. And then I'll come along with that light gray too and fill some in. I got the raw sienna and burnt sienna on my brush. And this, I want to use that dry brush technique where I take some of the paint off. And this rock down here is kind of speckled with that light and dark brown color. So I'm just, with a dry brush, just putting a little bit of texture here and here. Dry brush, hardly any paint on, little bit of texture into the rock. Same, I'm going to add a little bit of gray to it. Same behind the house here. Drying my brush off, so I've got barely any paint on it. Barely any paint. A little bit of texture in here. These are your final details. We may not get to all of them today. They take a lot of time putting all these little tiny details in. Where I've got the top of the roof here, it's not very straight because the masking fluid doesn't work very well. So I can straighten that up. Get my bigger brush. I want to make a dark bluey green again, maybe some ultramarine blue, some azo yellow. Let's bring it over here. So I've got, on top of that cobalt, I've got some ultramarine blue, azo yellow to make a green. And then I want to do some burnt sienna with it. A little bit of cobalt maybe. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit muddy because I want to go behind this house and straighten up this roof with that dark green. And I want to take it down into the shadows here and the rocks. I've got my big brush at the moment. I'm going to switch at any minute now. I just wanted to get that nice straight one behind there. And I'm going to go to my little brush again, get that green. And now I want to just get water on my little brush. I'm going to take that green and just swish it around with that little bit of water on my brush and make it into like rough grass as it comes up the hill. But what I want is that I want that dark against the roof. I can still go back and put that dark in, and it's really, really rough land here. So there's potholes, there's rocks, there's scrubby grass. And then the houses won't look so strange, sort of sitting there in a very bland landscape. So I went over the side of that blue house. Take off. I do have to do a lot more shadow by the blue house. There is quite, let's get some more burnt sienna. There is quite dark shadow on this side of the house. I put into my gray, I put some burnt sienna and some green. And at the side of this house here, it's pretty dark, coming down to the beach area. And the shadows go across the beach and in front of the house. And I think there's some like scrubby trees there. The shadow, there's definite really dark shadows under here, under these logs. But once you start to put some of those in, the houses don't look so stark. And again, there's rocks up behind here. And there's rocks up behind here. Rocks in that grass that I put down. You might not be there yet, but there's rocks in it. And rocks over here. And I hope you can see, like, it's a process. It's quite a slow process of putting in little bit at a time, little bit of dark shadow, little bit of darker green, little bit of this, and then we have all of this light gray beach that we haven't put in yet. So I've got that light pinky gray, and I've got to remember that there's a few logs here and there. I'm going to put in that light sort of gray for the beach. And again, coming down the side of that cliff, there's quite a bit of light gray shadow and texture. And then once I've got the light gray in, I can always come in with the darker gray, wet in wet, and put a little bit of that into. But I'll probably wait until that the light gray is a little bit drier. There was, I'm going to the cobalt blue, just cobalt blue. There was a shadow right here on the side of that roof. There's a shadow under this roof here. And some I'm going to put some shadow on the siding of the house. And there's a little bit of shadow under this roof. And then these blue huts need a lot more shadow on them too. A lot more shadow. Oh, and even the ocean needs more shadow. Ocean needs more shadow here. Tons of shadow to put in. It's just, it's amazing how much you need. I'm just going to show you where these houses are. I'm going to take the ultramarine blue that we've been using for the shadow color, and I'm added a bit more ultramarine blue. I'll add a little bit of azo yellow into it. So I'm going to get a really greeny blue, a little bit of burnt sienna. Some burnt sienna here. I want a really sort of dark greeny blue color. And right at the edge here, it needs to be much, much darker. So I'm putting that greeny blue color on, getting a clean wet brush, and I'm going to just use that clean wet brush to soften that color in so it kind of bleeds into the ultramarine. So it's sort of dark near the edge, and then it bleeds into the ultramarine. The same over here, right at the edge of this island is very, very dark. So I'm going to put that really dark greeny blue color in. It just comes the edge of the island there. And I'm going to take a wet brush and just bleed that color down into the ultramarine so it's not too separate. And a little bit more. So that's the edge of the tape. And all along this shore is very, very dark, really dark. So I can go back and put a bit more in. The nice thing is once you've blended it in with a wet brush, you can still come back and do the wet in wet. This is not a time, you don't have to worry about it streaking. This is when you're doing streaks in the water, so you don't have to worry about it. And I really, really need to get that nice dark edge to the shore, some dark pebbles, dark here. And I added a little bit of azo yellow so we get that more of an ocean green to these darks. This whole edge here, I'm doing dry brush now, not the wet. This whole area is a lot more dark and a lot more green. So we're coming up to nearly 4 o'clock and there's still a lot to do on this one. It's incredible how long it does take to do the small details. There's lots of things like these little trees that will be the very last thing that you do. The big trees coming from here are one of the very last things that you will do. And I know you're probably not even close to where I am right now. It's hard to know what to do, whether to sit and wait for you, whether to go on. There's still more layers to do of the top of this. I can see that it needs a lot more green back here, a greeny brown. I've got like burnt sienna mixed with the green. So I've got that green color. I'm going to mix some burnt sienna with it. So it's a dull green. And these areas need some more sketchy kind of dark green on them. And coming into this hollow here needs a bit more gray. So I've got the gray color. And I want to bring all of these parts here, just touching with my tip of my brush, getting in this texture that looks like kind of scrubby grass on the back of the island. And I want to sharpen up this shadow on the side of the house, side of the shack here, sharpen that up. And under the fence. And there's some steps coming up here, the edge of the steps here. And all around this house, there is shadow everywhere. Then there's logs, and under the logs there is shadow. So this is the time to just play with all of these little details. Hopefully, if you've got the photograph close by on your phone or on your iPad or print it out, you can observe all the little details carefully and start like really looking at them, thinking, okay, we've got some shadows under these logs, put a shadow under this log here, and this one, shadows under here, and then dot, 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 dot on the shore, because there's lots of rocks on the shore. And I haven't really finished with the shadows over here either. There's still a little bit more to do with these, putting a few more shadows on this shore, and there's a few logs over here. Probably a bit darker over here in places. Although this island at the back doesn't need quite as much detail as it's in the background. A bit more grassy color here. It's starting to take shape. I do need to get a bit more shadow on these houses. So let's go to the cobalt and mix it with a little bit of the gray that I have mixed here, burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is always great for making a gray. And I want to go over with that darker gray. I want to go over those right over the house and put it in more shadow. And I know it's shining in the camera right now. It's kind of shining in the light, but that has shaded it down. So that it's not quite so bright. I'm kind of just looking for the real dark spots. I think there's some steps here somewhere that make a real dark spot. I know the light's shining on that a bit, so it's hard to see. So there's still quite a bit of just playing around with the background colors back here with a little bit more kind of rocks to put in, a little bit more sort of scrubby grass to put in. Kind of along where these trees are, it's quite a bit darker back here. I'm just trying to think if I lift it a little bit, it's not quite so shiny. And then I have all these little trees. Where's my little, you can do those with either a tiny, tiny brush or a pen if you feel that they're too tiny for you to do with a brush. I'm going to add a little bit of sepia to my gray to make them a little bit more brown. And just make sure I don't have too much paint in my brush. I've just put paint in this, it's probably a little bit damp. And with my tiny, tiny brush now, I have all these very old, dry trees that I can put in. And again, you can mix either sepia with your ultramarine blue, or you can mix burnt sienna with your ultramarine blue, or a combination, or just use a brown or a black pen. And I always like tap a little bit of the paint off on my Kleenex before I paint with it, because it might have too much on, even though it's a tiny brush. And I want to put those little trees, those almost like dead trees. And they come up over the border of this island. Too much paint on my brush there. It's a good idea to start at the bottom of the trunk and then come up the branches and lift your brush as you come up to the finer branches towards the top. Then they will sort of trail off and get thinner. Whereas if you start at the top, it'll be thick at the top and then thinner as you come down the tree, which is kind of not how they grow. I'm holding my breath as I'm doing this because they're very, very small. My brush is very small and it's kind of tricky to get in there, and you can barely see because I have to get my hand over there to get some control. And I know you may not be up where I am yet, but I have to move on to get the painting done within a reasonable amount of time. And you can always go back and work on all these details after we're finished and when I get my video done and uploaded. We got those in. And again, with the small brush and this dark color, I can come back and do even a little bit more in the way of rocks and scrubby grass and texture in the background, especially if you've got these trees, a little bit of that browny green color. If you've got these trees where they're growing, there's quite a bit of darker sort of grass there. So it sort of it grounds them if you have something underneath them rather than just kind of growing out of a light area. So I'm putting a little bit more texture in there. A little bit more. Also over here, I can see there's a lot more sort of texture over here. And there's shadow along here. And bits of rock sticking up. And let's put it down and have a look. One thing I do notice is over here is a lot darker than over here. So I want to darken up this shadow here a bit more so that the one in the foreground should be darker than the one in the middle ground. And maybe these windows need to be darkened up a bit in the roof. Even this shadow a little bit more dark. A little bit. And then one last thing I have to do, and you may not be there yet, but I need these trees coming from the corner here. I think they're really important to the composition because they block this corner so your eye doesn't disappear out the corner of the composition. They actually lead the eye in, so they lead the eye in and around these huts and up and around the boat. So it kind of really finishes off the composition. So what I usually do if I'm doing trees like this is I draw the actual line of the center of the branch. That one comes across here and that one comes across here. And then there's one that comes across here. I just have the basic lines, and then I put the trees over those lines. So I'm going to mix Phthalo Blue and Azo Yellow and Burnt Sienna. So I'm going to have a stronger green for these foreground ones using the Phthalo Blue. Oh, let's get my bigger brush to mix my paint. I don't need to ignore the paint that's here. I can just put my Phthalo Blue right over the top of it to mix a different green. And I want quite a bit because I've got quite a few branches. And then the yellow. Look at that lovely, lovely, vibrant green I've got now. That's way too vibrant for those branches. If you look, if I put that beside these, it's too vibrant. So I'm going to bring that down with the burnt sienna to a more acceptable green for those branches, and maybe even a little bit of ultramarine blue. And let's test that. Much better. Oh, sorry, you can't even see me testing it. There we go. Much better. And I am going to work with my number 6 brush, I think, and get a good amount of that green on it. I might even switch to my number 4. I have to see how it goes. And I will start with the first one here. And I don't want to get too fussy about these. If I get too fussy, they're going to look too contrived. Just want to get the general look. Branch coming in here. And these are fir trees, so that just there's the big branch that comes up here is quite light. If I want it that light, I might have to use some white, but I'm going to take some raw sienna up there first, and I might add some white later to lighten that one up. And it doesn't have much greenery on it, that one. Have some raw sienna on this brush and add a little bit of greenery to it. It's kind of like almost a dead branch there. Again, I know the light is kind of reflecting badly. I'm going to lift it up just a little bit for you. There is one very big branch coming up through here. I'm using the tip of my brush to make those fir needles. And sort of a branch beside it. I'm sorry, I'm quiet because I'm looking at all the branches on my photo here, trying to gauge where to put them. So they're going to look like what they're supposed to. And that's not so much just copying the shape, it's just copying or being clear about the position of where they are and how much space there is between them, how much you can see, like close to the corner here. don't see much ocean between them. There's quite a mass there. But then as they branch out, you can see more ocean between them. So I don't want to have such a thick mass. So that's what I'm really looking at, is where is the greatest mass of green, and then don't overdo it. The corner is quite let me bring it over here. See what I'm talking about. The corner here is quite a dark mess of green, and then it opens up a bit. Having the corners covered is great because it's a stopper. It stops your eye from going out the corner of that painting and brings your eye in instead. And that's kind of important. The same thing with your dark ocean at this side. I've still got that same green on my brush, making sure I've got some stopper on that side and some here. And I'm taking a lot of that green off of the brush and just dragging it across this top of this rock. And I still have that green on my brush, and I'm going to drag it, just drag it over this dry paper. Just dragging it like it's almost dry, but it's giving that scrubby grass texture as I drag it over the paper. Another place we could have a bit of texture with burnt sienna. Get some. Again, get it on my brush, dry it off of my brush. And there's some texture of burnt sienna here too. I can drag across. Yeah, your brush has to be almost dry to do that sort of texturing. And then we're just about almost finished. I am anyway. I expect you're miles behind me saying, slow down, slow down, slow down. And I just zoomed back the camera a little bit. Some things I could do is tidy up the sails with some Dr. P.H. Martin's white, and tidy up any white bits that have kind of got lost along the way if I needed to. Let's get some. I'm trying to make sure I got really clean brush and really, really clean water, because oh no, I didn't. It's blue. Great. I want at least a little bit of blue in the white. Shouldn't hurt it too much. Just scrape a bit out of there. I'll tip that out there. I think my white's fine. It'll be okay. I got a little tray here with some white on. And I need my very thin brush, my little liner brush. There it is. My lovely Princeton liner. I can get thin lines with the liner brush. So I do want to I wanted to lighten up that one branch that's coming in there. That sail, I got a very unpleasant line with the masking fluids. So I just want to kind of straighten up that line a little bit. I probably just should have painted the sails in afterwards with the P.H. Martin's white. It's so much easier. And you get a nice clean line that way. Other places, if you've lost any of your logs on the shore, or if you've lost any of your whites on the houses or anywhere like that, you can always use the white to fill those back in if you wanted something like that. If you wanted any white caps on the ocean, if some of this reflection is quite light, so you could always take your white and you could put a bit more light reflection from here. If you wanted any like little white caps or waves, if you have a almost dry brush, you can drag it across and get a few more of those if you wanted them. So there's a lot of things you can do to finish it up with the white if you need to, especially if my roof, the masking fluid was horrible on the top of the roof, and I might want to really sharpen up the top of my roof and get a nicer edge to it than I had. And anywhere else that you feel. On the sides of these doors, I'll have to go over this with a bit of light blue, but there was a little bit of white areas here that of course are in shade, so I'll have to go over them, but I can pick them back up again with a little bit of this white and then go over with a little bit of light blue to put them in the shade. Give that a little bit more detail. And I think the logs too is the main thing, because it's easier to get those in over the dark gray with the white when you're finished than to try and leave those little tiny little bits of log showing. And I think when this is all dry, I will go back between those logs and put a little bit more of the dark gray in and a little bit more rock texture. But it's so far away. Sometimes you don't need to do that much texture. You just need to suggest something, and it still looks like what it's supposed to. Here too, I might want to get just a little bit more dark shadow in places over here for the rocks, and a little bit more rock texture. There's quite a lot going on, but again, like I said, you don't want to have too much going on because it is your middle ground there, so you don't want to draw too much attention to it. And even this shadow here, I'm going to take it down a little bit, and I might put a bit more blue on it to push it into the background. I think it's too brown right now, and it's coming forward. Whereas if I put a bit more blue into the shadow, I can push it back a little bit. I'm going to go over it later with a bit more blue when it's a bit more dry, and push that back a little bit more, not so brown, but more blue gray. And even the side of this little shack, I still think this side could be a little bit more in shadow, like the photograph, which now I've put the paint on, it's all wet and shiny, so you can't really see. But there we go, Shack Island, number 2, Nanaimo, British Columbia, with all the summer shacks. So let's Well, I wasn't quite finished after that nearly 2.5 hours painting, and I expect it's going to take you a bit longer. I'll finish mine up tomorrow, and you can do the finishing touches on yours when you're ready. But I hope you enjoyed this one. See you again next week for more painting. Bye now.